and welcome to the iGaming Next podcast. Today with us, Matthew Shaddick of GVC, Head of Politics. How are you doing today, Matthew?
Great. Thanks for inviting me, Pierre.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's a very current topic today with the election, the US election, just a couple of days away. And what better person to make predictions and talk about what is going to happen in this election than the head of politics for GVC. I wanted to start off by mentioning, I think that whatever your political belief or affiliation is, as a bookmaker in this election, you really want Biden to win next week. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm sure almost every similar bookmaker in the world must be feeling the same way, because the punters that our customers are just overwhelmingly wanting to back Trump. So far this week, about 60% of the money we've taken is for Trump, and that's been the pattern for several months now. Yeah,
and I saw the presentation you did the other day with the EGBA when you talked about this the discrepancies between Trump and Biden and where the punters are putting their money. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why do you think that so many people are betting on Trump?
I mean, there's a number of ways of looking at this. I mean, it's really just, in my opinion, just a very... This is mostly psychological, what's happening in this market. When you see the prices move up and down, they're usually not connected to any polls or anything that's actually happening in the real world. What we've got, in my opinion, are groups of people who just share different sources of information. And a lot of this is driven by social media, people living in their own bubbles of confirmation bias. And there are a huge group of people out there who think Trump's going to win, who don't care what the polls say. They are incredibly confident he's going to win. We are taking money on Trump to get over 60% of the vote, to win every state. There are a lot, there are people backing this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And they're not really interested in evidence or polls or the kind of information that I would look at to set the odds. And on the other side, you've got the kind of liberal side of politics who are terrified that 2016 is going to repeat itself, who are traumatized by the fact that Trump got elected in the first place, who, even if they think that the polls are probably right, are just too anxious to let themselves believe it ahead of time. And those people aren't correcting the market by backing Biden. So you've got these two things pointing in the same direction, leading to what appears to be a completely skewed market. If you compare the odds to where the polls are, they're just light years away.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the most prominent poll aggregator would be 538, right? Project 538, and they have Trump's chances of winning at 13%.
And the betting at the moment is saying 35% chance of Trump winning.
Yeah,
now, in 2016, 538 model was very closely aligned to where the odds were. The model gave Trump a slightly better chance of winning than the bookies did mostly, so you'd have done well by following the model.
Yeah.
But this year, they're separated by this huge gulf of 20 or 30% of probability. And I mean, that if you had a model which, predicted sports results and was 20% away from the betting markets, well, it's a hopeless model. You can throw it in the bin, right? You can't possibly be that far away and be accurate. But this time around, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, exactly. So that begs the question a little bit. So 538, they are obviously basing their win probability for Trump completely based on what the polls are saying, right?
Well, almost exclusively. I think they have a few other variables to do with the economy and so on, but mostly now it'll be to do with the polls, and in particular the polls in the individual states.
Okay, but at the same time, I mean, from your end as a bookmaker, you have to you have to take an objective look at the entire culture and election and everything that's happening around it, which is a bit more subjective, so to say, than what 538 potentially can do to get the true odds and understand the true picture of the election. When you look and when you try to understand the true odds of the outcome of the election, what other variables other than the polls do you take into consideration?
Well, I'm one of those people who overwhelmingly just want to see what the polls say. I mean, if you want to try and work out how people are going to vote, the best thing to do is ask them how they're going to vote and try and get a representative sample. And so normally there are quite often elections where the polls and the betting differ a little bit. That's normal. Normally, I would, from my personal punting point of view and my professional point of view, take the side of the polls, and I think that generally turns out to be the more effective, efficient way of doing things. But I mean, there are other things you can think about in this election. I mean, particularly you can think about what's going to happen afterwards if it's very close. Because if there's a contested result, I mean, you could argue that Trump is in a better position to turn that to his advantage, given that he is the president and Republicans control the Senate, and now they control the Supreme Court effectively. And so maybe you should build in things like that. Maybe that makes 1 or 2% difference to your estimates of what's going to happen. But as for the other factors that I think people are building in, notably, there seem to be a lot of people who think the polls are simply going to be wrong because of their shy Trump voters. I'm massively skeptical of most of those other explanations of why the polls might be wrong.
Yeah, because that would be that you would be able to kind of factor in that if that would be a true bias, you would be able to factor that in, especially comparison to what the poll said in 2016 and what the actual result was. So that would be easy to kind of count away. But what I'm thinking more is like, this cycle is so different from other cycles in the sense that we are right in the smack middle of a pandemic. That might scare away certain demographics to vote, but other demographics might be more inclined to vote. And I mean, it's also a election cycle that is completely different in many other ways too. Even without the pandemic, it seems to be the most polarized election that there ever was. I mean, in a lot of ways. And you have one side who is trying to discredit the entire system as it's with the mail-in voting, for example, trying to discredit people from using that system. And then the question is, how is that going to affect kind of there might be various demographics who will be more likely to vote and other demographics that are less likely to vote. Is that something you factor into? Or
I mean, I think it's fair to say that those factors you just mentioned, to do with the pandemic and to do with change in voting habits, people voting by mail more often, it looks like we're going to have a much bigger turnout than usual. It's fair to say that all adds an extra bit of uncertainty to what we're looking at. So if you had a model which didn't account for that, then you might say, well, perhaps you should be a bit less confident about the fact that you think Biden's going to win. And I think some models, to be fair, I think the 538 model has essentially added a bit more uncertainty on just to try and reflect that. Other ones won't have done. On the other hand, as you mentioned before, the kind of increased polarization of the US electorate, that might make you more confident that the polls are going to be right, because it seems less likely that anyone's going to change their mind. There's a smaller pool of persuadable voters. And this is, I mean, there was a model that The Economist have been released several months ago, which has always been incredibly bullish on Biden's chances. And one of the reasons is that they said, we're in an environment now where it's just very, very hard to change anyone's mind. People are divided into two separate camps. There are very few undecided voters compared to 2016 at this stage. There were still quite a lot of people who apparently hadn't made their mind up, and those people broke for Trump. This time around, it doesn't seem like that's a possibility.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point you're mentioning, because in the 2016 election, I think at this point there was a huge amount of undecided voters at this stage. Whereas, like you're saying now, then at this stage, at the moment, there are very few uncertain people. People have made up their minds already, and a lot of people have already voted. That's the
exactly. We may have half the population of people who are going to vote have already voted, so there's no chance of them changing their mind, obviously.
No. And I think this is a bit of a misunderstanding from the general public that the polls in 2016, they were actually pretty accurate, right? Like, a lot of people think that they were not, but they were actually pretty accurate. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, they are. I mean, Trump overperformed a little bit, but nationally not by very much. I mean, the final polls were, on average, saying Clinton would win by about 3% nationally, and she won by 2%. So that's pretty good. They were certainly out in a few of the really, really crucial states, especially in the Midwest. But it's worth remembering that pollsters look at that and they say, well, how do we get that wrong in those states? They make some corrections. In particular, it appears they didn't have enough white people without college degrees in their samples. So they either try and find more of those or they upweight them, which will, in theory, solve the problem. And in fact, in previous elections in the UK, we've seen that when pollsters tried to correct for past errors, they tend to overcorrect, and then in the next election you find that the bias has gone the other way. So I certainly don't rule out the possibility that Biden could end up beating the polls.
Yeah, on the polls themselves now, because I mean, if we go back a couple of decennia, when everyone used their phone, which is, I guess, the most reliable way of conducting a poll. And then we fast forward to today. If you want to have this this wide range of the demographic that exists in society and carry out the polls in the best possible way, how accurate do you think that pollsters are able to conduct these polls now, with this in mind, that it's just so difficult to get people to pick up their phone?
Yeah, you're right. It's got more difficult for pollsters because it's harder to get in touch with people. People are less open to the idea of speaking to cold callers about anything. On the other hand, if you look historically at the patterns of polls versus results, the average error hasn't changed at all. Polls are about as accurate now as they were 10 or 20 years ago. So the idea, I mean, a lot of people have got the idea that they've got much worse because we had a couple of surprises recently.
Yeah.
But actually, on average, across various countries, pollsters seem to be doing about as well as they ever have.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end of the day, the surprises that we've had is still within the error margin within the polls, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. You have a couple of close elections. I mean, the ones that people talk about a lot with the Brexit referendum in the UK and Trump's win. Well, they were pretty close. The polls weren't very far away in either case. It's just the polls were, they just switch the other way and you get a different result, and that creates a huge headline. When you have elections where people forecast to win by 10% and they win by 15%, well, that's quite a big miss, but nobody will ever talk about that ever again.
Yeah, exactly. But that begs the question still. And so, I mean, at the moment, I think Biden is polling ahead like 9% or something like that in average, and which is, I mean, in itself pretty remarkable that the gap is so big. But so with the polls being so consistent for so long, and the odds are still, like you as a bookmaker are still putting 37% chance for Trump. Is that completely attributed to the fact that the betting volumes are so big on Trump, or is there other factors too?
No, from our point of view, it's just a question of, I believe the odds we're putting out are totally unrepresentative of the real probabilities, which doesn't happen very often. Because 70% of the money we take on an average week is for Trump. That's how it's gone this week so far. And you've got to choose tread a fine line between saying, well, we really want to lay Trump because we think his price is way too short. But on the other hand, even a large organisation like GVC doesn't necessarily want to lose tens of millions of pounds on the outcome of one election or one soccer match. It would very rarely be in a position where that would happen. We've got the prices where we think are managing our risk and also taking advantage of what we think the prices should be. So that's the reason why the prices are where they are, not because we think these are what the true prices of what's going to happen are, but because we've just got to manage this kind of slightly exceptional market. Yeah,
true. And what was, if we compare this, the betting volumes of Trump now in 2020 compared to 2016? Because I remember 2016, the odds were much lower on Hillary to win at that time.
Yeah,
they were much closer to where the polls were. So was that also a reflection of the betting volumes, or were the betting volumes still skewing towards Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think most bookmakers lost quite a lot of money on Trump in 2016. The market was skewed towards him. And we came into this election with a very strong prior belief that the markets would overrate his chances compared to the polls, partly because that's what happens in every election these days. If there's a populist or nationalist candidate on the ballots, we always find that the betting markets skew towards them. There's a very strong belief among people that those kind of parties do better than the polls suggest. There isn't really any evidence for that. Sometimes they do, but mostly they're about accurate. So we kind of thought this would happen. Although I must admit, I didn't think it would happen to quite the extent that it is right now. And partly it's because even back in 2016, I can remember us taking some very large bets on Clinton. There was still plenty of people willing to back her. And this time around, I've seen reports of a few big bets being placed with other bookmakers. There seems to be slightly less of that business around to try and hold up the price a bit more.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, so I mean, it's so interesting that you, like you're saying, it's so rare that you see an event, a sports betting event, that where the reality is so skewed from.
I mean, it's interesting, Pierre. The best example that people
Yeah.
have given, and I think it's actually quite an apposite one, was the fight between Mayweather and McGregor
And
about 3
McGregor,
years
yeah,
away.
that's very
Because
true.
I mean, I don't know anything about boxing or UFC, but
Yeah.
I remember at the time every expert in the world said this is insane. Mayweather should be 1.1, but the wave of public money for McGregor, which is so huge, the bookmakers couldn't keep the price where they thought it should be. They had to, there was a lot of hedging going on there because people were getting multi-million-pound liabilities on the result of this one weird event. And we're in a similar situation here. Everyone who knows anything about polling or political science or markets says Biden is the greatest bet of all time. But the overall market doesn't care because the wave of public money the other way is just too strong.
Yeah, exactly. When people bet on their feelings, rather than reality, like that's when these type of things happen. I remember Conor McGregor and Mayweather as well, because I'm in the martial art world quite a lot, and we talked a lot about this, actually, exactly what we were talking about now, that the odds were so good. Even 1.1 to Mayweather would have been incredibly good odds as well, because I mean, we're talking about the best boxer in the world ever, and against someone who had never.
Yeah, I mean, just
fight,
going off a bit of a tangent here, but I remember the best argument I heard for the other side was that actually Mayweather financially might have been better off losing that fight, because then he could have engineered an even bigger, more expensive, more lucrative rematch.
Yeah,
so I suppose you had to have that at the back of your mind, but I don't see that. I don't see that Biden's got any incentive to lose this election.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it would be more maybe if he was injured or something. I think that would be.
Mate, yes, that's,
there's
always that sign of possibility. And of course, nobody's saying Trump can't win this election. I mean, if we get a polling miss, the 2015 UK election is kind of the best example of, we had incredibly stable polls for months before that election, saying it was going to be a very close election, and the Conservative Party ended up winning by 7 points.
Yeah.
Now, if Trump gets that sort of polling error in his favour, and then the Electoral College works out in a way favourably for him like it did last time, well, yeah, sure, he can win. But that's anyone taking, thinking that's a 40% chance is that, well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems to be an extremely slim chance for him to actually win the public vote, but the electoral vote worked in his favor in this case, right? Because you don't necessarily need to have more than 50% of the votes in the US to win the election, so you just need to win the key states, so to say.
I mean, I think it looks as if he was to get within, let's say, 3 points nationally, he'd have a pretty good chance of winning from there. Because as you say, the geographical spread of his votes is just a bit more efficient for him.
Yeah, and exactly, and the Electoral College, it favors the Republicans in general, right? So the Democrats
at the moment. I mean,
a
couple of elections ago, it probably was slightly tilted in favor of the Democrats, and if the Democrats start winning Texas, then in a sense their vote becomes more efficient. But
true. Do you think they have a chance of taking Texas?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I mean, I back them. I mean, I think 2 to 1 or bigger is a fairly big price. You look at the incredible levels of turnouts that are being reported, early turnout in Texas, in most of these major urban areas. It's really quite hard to see how that is going to work out in anything other than Biden's favor. The polls are close anyway there. I mean, the average poll Trump's got is only just over 1%.
Yeah, it's 1% difference. Yeah, incredible, for such a red state, generally.
Yeah, but when people have been saying for years that because the non-white population is increasing very rapidly in Texas, particularly Hispanics, that was eventually going to work out in the Democrats' favor, and sooner or later they would win it. So perhaps it'll come around this time.
And also they had, do you think also it can be attributed to, they had the Senate race recently, was it 2 years ago, with the like a really popular Democratic candidate. He didn't win, but it seemed that he really opened people's eyes up to
I mean, Beto O'Rourke, he got very, very close to beating Ted Cruz 2 years ago. And in some ways you'd say Joe Biden is a easier candidate to sell than Beto O'Rourke was in Texas. So, you kind of expect Biden to do maybe slightly better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if the Democrats would take Texas, then if Texas would turn blue and stay blue, then the Republicans will have really difficulty to take the presidency in the next generations. I mean, if they were to lose that state.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's just hard to see where they're going to get those votes back from, unless unless the Midwest and the East really start swinging heavily in the sort of Republican favor. What you might do is it becomes proportionately a bit more white than the rest of the country. Then they do seem to have a big problem.
Yeah, that's definitely for sure. Yeah, it will be so interesting. I think we learned so much from this election. I mean, what do you think now, Matthew? Another thing that has been spoken about now is the election is on Tuesday, obviously, and because of the much larger amount of mail-in ballots that has to be counted, they think that it might be the results of the election might be delayed for some time. What do you estimate? Like, when do you think we'll have an actual answer?
Yeah, somebody else was asking me that today. I mean, it's impossible to say. I mean, we on the one hand, we want to pay people out as soon as the results beyond any doubt. I'm hoping that, by Wednesday morning, Biden will have won Florida and North Carolina already, and it's more or less over, and we can pay out very quickly. But as you say, a lot of the states that are going to be very crucial here have are likely to take quite a long time to resolve their results. Pennsylvania's been one that's been talked about. So it's certainly not impossible. We could be waiting days, even weeks. In 2000, it took weeks to sort that election out.
Exactly.
So if it's close and it's contested, then we could be waiting for all sorts of constitutional and legal objections before we know who's actually won. Yeah,
exactly. It could take time. And I mean, I would assume as well that this is something you must think as well about, I guess, if the race is fairly close, then you would think that Trump is going to try to stall or try to steal or stall the election as much as possible. I mean, it's unlikely that he's just going to accept defeat if it trends towards that, right? Is that something you factor into the odds as well?
Yeah, I mean, not that it changes my view of the odds, but I mean, you do, if it's close, you have to worry about that sort of thing. I mean, a lot of people have said that if that happened, if everyone can see that Biden's actually won, but Trump is managing to stop mail-in votes being counted on some legal technicality or something, in fact, most of the Republicans in any position of power, the Senate, for example, even though they've been, fairly loyal to Trump over the last 4 years, people have said that actually these guys are not going to let Trump do that. They will know that this could destroy the Republicans for a very long time if they try to, quote unquote, steal the election. So, you've got to be slightly worried about it, but I think the probability of that happening must be very, very small.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, the other argument as well that you can say is that the Republicans have sold themselves a bit to Trump during the last 4 years, and you could also argue that without Trump, that they are also going to face kind of questions from the public, like how you could kind of side with certain things during the 4 years and so forth. How they could move away from the original.
I mean, if Trump does lose and lose heavily, then it's going to be interesting to see how the Republicans cope with that, whether they can just wash away the last 4 years, pretend it never happened, or whether, in 4 years' time, it's hard to say who's going to be the candidate. Is it going to be someone else a bit like Trump, or a more, as it were, normal senator or governor or someone? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So this will be interesting to see, right? Because it seems like the Republican Party will take either of the two directions. Like, either it will be a new generation taking over Republicans, or perhaps a little bit more moderate, like the previous candidate. Now I lose his name.
Romney.
Romney, it's like a more moderate way, like Romney. Or perhaps they will move even more towards like the Tea Party type, more extreme right, and kind of have a Trump reincarnated candidate. What do you think? I mean, you followed this for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, they could find themselves in a difficult position because the Republican electorate, the people who vote in primaries to decide who their candidate is going to be, Trump is a big part of the cultural identity of these people now, or at least a lot of them. It's going to be quite hard to swing these back to just some normal conservative Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio type candidates. They're going to be, if you turn up and you're, I don't know, it could easily be Donald Trump Jr., couldn't it? Or some other similar type Trumpist candidate. I mean, I've had one bet on 2024 already. I've bet Tucker Carlson, who's a Fox News anchor.
Yes, Fox News, yeah.
Quite a influential commentator these days, who's, I guess you could say, fairly Trumpy in most of his views. And I've heard a few people saying that he's thinking about running. So,
yeah, that would exactly. It would be a candidate like that, perhaps. Yeah, someone who is more in the public eye as a political commentator. But then you also need to want that job. You know, like if you're a Tucker Carlson, you know, like behind the scenes, you have a family or whatever. Like taking that job is not so straightforward, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'll be fascinating to see. I mean, on the other side, actually, it'll be fascinating to see how people react to the possibility of, well, whether Biden, assuming he wins, is going to be the candidate in 4 years' time, because, you know, there's a lot of people on the right certainly say there's absolutely no chance whatsoever of Biden being around in 4 years' time. And it'll be Kamala Harris or some other person. So that'll be another interesting contest.
Yeah, it will be for sure. I mean, Matthew, you've been covering political events for a long time. I read your bio. You covered the first political rally in 2008 with when Obama obviously took the presidency in the US. Can you kind of make any comparisons to these 4 elections cycles that you have covered? Like, how is this different? Like, and comparison to previous elections, is it more difficult to predict, easier, or like, do you see any distinct differences?
I mean, just professionally, it's just got a lot bigger. I mean, there's an awful lot more money bet on these events now than there were for Obama won 4 years ago. I mean, in a way, I'd like to rerun Obama v. McCain in the current climate, because I think at the time there was another situation where the polls were clearly pointing to Obama winning, but at that time there was a very large body of opinion that says, I don't care what the poll says, the Americans aren't going to elect a non-white candidates. So I don't know if people have got over that yet. But has he got any more unpredictable? I mean, I think Trump himself has added something just completely different. He's such an unusual candidate. And of course, he's just got so much worldwide fame and notoriety and interest surrounding him that I think he personally is the reason why this is going to be the biggest betting event, or biggest political betting event of all time. I hope it'll still be as exciting in 4 years' time. I suppose Trump could be there in 4 years' time, but assuming it's a couple of other candidates. But I'm not sure whether Joe Biden versus Mike Pence would create such
so much hype. Yeah, exactly. There was someone who I spoke with a friend the other day who said that if whatever your political belief is and whatnot, at least Trump has made politics in the public eye. You know, people know the difference between the presidency, the House, and the Senate now. But someone else said as well, like that they really wish that politics become boring again.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to know what people are going to talk about and bet on after Trump's gone.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go back to the start now, Matthew, then so 538 has the election at around 13% for Trump, or so 14%. What would you agree that if you would guess the true odds, like would you agree that would be kind of where the true odds are, or would you agree more with the economist's estimation, which is more like 5%?
Well, 5% seems incredibly confident, right? I mean, if somebody offered me 20-1 on Trump, yeah, of course I'd back him. I think there's just a bit too much uncertainty. You referred to earlier with what's happening with the pandemic. Just creates a completely different environment. We were talking before, I mean, if you just said, if you took the names away and you said there's a candidate here who's been ahead in the polls for months, is 9 points ahead, there's 4 days to go, half the population have already voted, well, he'd assume he'd be at least a 90% chance of winning.
Yeah.
So the fact that the betting markets are still sat at 35% chance of Trump winning is still mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. It's. I mean, taking even the Conor McGregor fight was, even though the odds were skewed, they weren't skewed that much in comparison to what we are seeing now, right? Like, this must be an event that is unprecedented when it comes to like skewed odds. Is there anything you can?
I mean, politically, the only other example I can think of is the 2017 French presidential election.
Okay.
Where the betting markets were acting as if Marine Le Pen was, let's say, about 4 or 5 points behind Emmanuel Macron in the polls.
Yeah.
Whereas in fact she was 25 or 30 points behind Macron in the polls. And she was a sort of 4-1 shot when you'd think she should be a 50-1 shot.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a weird disparity, but that's the only one I can think of that comes close.
Yeah, interesting. and how big is this event for GVC in general? Is and especially comparing to volumes previous election cycles?
So I think it'll be about double 2016, which was the previous records for a political betting event or any non-sports events.
Yeah.
I think there's a good chance it will be the biggest single event we take market that we trade this year.
Wow.
Normally, for UK-based bookmakers, it would be the Grand National, but that didn't happen this year. So I think there's a good chance that this will be number one. It'll be bigger than any single soccer match or any single horse race. And yeah, as I said before, it's quite unusual, even for a company our size, to have a one-off event where the swing between winning and losing will be many, many millions of pounds. It's not going to make any difference to the share price, but it's going to be a big day for everybody in the trading department.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you so much, Matthew, for coming on spontaneously today and discussing this. It's really interesting to hear your thoughts on this. And like I said, it's something that I'm personally following really closely as well. And I've wondered throughout this process, like I said, why the odds on the better markets have been so close when in reality the polls are saying so different. So really interesting that you clarified it for us actually. So thank you, Matthew, and I wish you a good weekend, and let's see how this goes now in a couple of days. The world might be different in one way or the other, and we'll see if the bookmakers are happy on Wednesday morning or if they are gonna be crying to work. So
okay, well, thanks, Pierre. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.